The drought killed our cattle first, then our friendship, then our souls. My neighbor and I, men whose fathers broke bread together, stood on opposite sides of the last water hole with rifles raised and children watching. I pulled the trigger to save my family, but the man who died wasn't the one I shot. Some debts the desert collects in ways you never expect. These lands know pain better than joy. Every mark in the sand tells a story, but folks rarely listen. I saw this tale with my own eyes, like the crackle of a fire at night. The shadows of the past don't leave. You'd best listen close. Out here, it's the only way to survive. The land died slowly, like a man bleeding from a wound no doctor could close. 3 years without rain had transformed the Arizona territory into a monument to God's indifference. What had once been rolling grassland rich enough to feed 10,000 head of cattle now stretched endless and brown, cracked earth opening like wounds that wouldn't heal, skeletal cattle scattered across the range like discarded prayers. Samuel Crane stood at the fence line between his property and the Holloway ranch, watching dust devils dance across what used to be prime grazing land. His hands, calloused from 40 years of ranching, weathered like the fence posts he leaned against, gripped the sun-bleached wood until his knuckles went white. Behind him, his ranch house stood defiant against the endless sky. But even from here he could see the marks of dying. The empty corrals, the barn where his remaining 12 cattle huddled in what little shade existed, the well that had run dry 3 months ago. Across the fence line, perhaps 200 yards distant, lay salvation and damnation in equal measure. Holloway Spring, the last water source for 50 miles in any direction. The spring bubbled up from deep limestone aquifers that even 3 years of drought hadn't exhausted, creating a small pond surrounded by green grass that looked obscene against the desert brown, like an emerald dropped in ash. Thomas Holloway's cattle, maybe 30 head, all that remain of herds that once numbered in thousands, clustered around the spring, drinking their fill while Samuel's livestock died of thirst visible from where their water flowed. The sight was a knife twisted daily in Samuel's gut, made worse by the knowledge that 15 years ago, he and Thomas would have shared that water without question, would have moved their combined herds together, would have faced this disaster as brothers in everything but blood. Their fathers had homesteaded this territory together in 1847, 2 young men from Missouri who'd heard about land rich enough to make any man prosper if he was willing to work. They'd built their ranches side by side, helped each other through Indian troubles and harsh winters and the 1,000 small catastrophes that come with trying to carve civilization from wilderness. Samuel and Thomas had grown up together, hunting, riding, getting drunk for the first time on whiskey stolen from Thomas's father's hidden supply. Samuel had been best man at Thomas's wedding. Thomas had held Samuel's firstborn son in the moments after the boy drew his first breath. Their families had celebrated Christmas together every year for 3 decades, their children growing up as close as cousins, their wives sharing recipes and consolation in equal measure. Then the drought came, and friendship proved less durable than desperation. The water rights dispute had started reasonably enough, a conversation between 2 worried men trying to figure out how to survive what was clearly going to be a disaster. Holloway Spring sat on Thomas's property, fed by aquifers that ran beneath both ranches. In what years, the distinction didn't matter because both ranches had their own wells. But when those wells ran dry and Holloway Spring became the only water for 50 miles, ownership suddenly transformed from abstract legal concept to matter of life and death. Samuel had approached Thomas 6 months ago, had literally in hand, and asked for access to the spring for his cattle. Just temporary, he'd promised. Just until the rains returned. Just enough to keep his herd alive, so he wouldn't lose everything his father and grandfather had built. Thomas had refused. Not out of cruelty. Samuel understood that even then, but out of his own terror. Thomas's herd was barely surviving on the spring's output. Adding Samuel's cattle would strain the resource beyond its capacity. Both herds would suffer. Better, Thomas reasoned with the cold mathematics of scarcity, that one ranch survive than both perish. Samuel had argued, then pleaded, then offered money he didn't have. Thomas had remained firm. his jaw set in that stubborn way Samuel knew meant no argument would penetrate. The conversation had ended with Samuel walking away, and neither man had spoken since except through lawyers arguing about water rights and property boundaries and legal precedents that meant nothing when your children were watching cattle die. Now, standing at the fence line in the brutal afternoon heat that made the air shimmer like water that would never fall, Samuel watched Thomas emerge from his ranch house. Even at this distance, Samuel could read his former friend's body language, the tired slope of his shoulders, the way he moved like a man carrying weight that exceeded what flesh and bone were designed to bear. Thomas saw Samuel watching and stopped. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other across 200 yards of dying land, connected by history and separated by necessity. Samuel raised one hand in a gesture that could have been greeting or farewell or question. Thomas didn't return it. He simply turned and walked toward the spring, toward his surviving cattle, toward the water he was protecting even as it destroyed everything their fathers had built together. Samuel walked back to his ranch house where his wife Martha was rationing the last of their stored water, barely enough for another week if they were careful, less if they weren't. His son Jacob, 16 years old and already carrying the gaunt look of someone who'd watched too much death, was mucking out the barn even though there were barely any cattle left to produce waste worth cleaning. His daughter Emma, 13 and fierce as her mother, stood on the porch with her arms crossed, glaring at the horizon as if she could intimidate the sky into producing rain through sheer force of will. "Still won't share?" Martha asked, though she already knew the answer from Samuel's expression. Samuel shook his head, his throat too tight for words. Martha's face hardened into something Samuel barely recognized, his gentle wife transformed by desperation into someone capable of calculus he didn't want to contemplate. "Then we take it," she said, her voice flat and certain. "We go tonight. We drive our cattle to that spring, and we let them drink. And if Thomas tries to stop us, we stop him first." "Martha," Samuel started, but she cut him off with a gesture sharp as a knife. "Our children are drinking water so brackish it makes them sick," she said, each word precise and deliberate. "Our cattle are dying in numbers. That mean we'll lose this ranch our family's built. And Thomas Holloway sits on enough water to save us both, but won't share because he's afraid." She stepped closer, her eyes boring into Samuel's. "I'm afraid too, but I'm more afraid of what happens if we do nothing." Samuel looked past his wife to where Jacob had stopped working and was watching this conversation with the peculiar intensity of a young man learning what desperation does to principles. Emma had moved closer too, listening, her young face already showing the hard lines that came from understanding that the world offered no guarantees of fairness. That night, Samuel loaded his rifle for the first time since the Apache troubles 30 years ago. The moon hung full and merciless over the Arizona territory, turning the landscape into a study in silver and shadow, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Samuel moved through this transformed world with 12 cattle, all that remained of a herd that had once numbered 300, driving them slowly, quietly toward Holloway Spring. Jacob rode beside him, his young face set with determination that couldn't quite hide the fear underneath. Martha had wanted to come too, but Samuel had forbidden it with a firmness that surprised them both. This was already going to stain his soul in ways he couldn't fully articulate. He wouldn't let his wife carry that same stain. The cattle smelled the water from a quarter-mile away and began moving faster, their thirst overriding their exhaustion. Samuel let them go, watching as they stumbled toward salvation, their skeletal bodies casting long shadows in the moonlight. That's when Thomas appeared. He emerged from the darkness near the spring with his own rifle held across his chest, not quite aimed but ready. 2 of his ranch hands flanked him, young men Samuel had known since they were children, now looking at him with expressions caught between sympathy and duty. "Can't let you do this, Sam," Thomas said, his voice carrying clear across the distance. "You know I can't." Samuel reined in his horse, his own rifle resting across his saddle, his hands visible but ready. "My cattle will die without water, Tom. My family will lose everything." and mine will lose everything if I share what barely keeps us alive," Thomas replied. His face in the moonlight looked haggard, aged a decade beyond his 42 years. "You think this is easy for me? You think I don't hate myself for what I'm doing? Then don't do it," Samuel said, and he heard the pleading note in his own voice, hated himself for it. "Share the water. We'll ration it together. Both our herds will be smaller, but both our families will survive." Thomas shook his head slowly, the gesture carrying the weight of a decision made and remade 1,000 times. "The spring can't support both herds, Sam. We've been over this. The engineers from Tucson confirmed it. The aquifer is dropping. Adding your cattle means we all die slower instead of some of us living." "So you chose yourself," Samuel said, and now his voice carried an edge sharp enough to cut. "You chose your family over mine." "Yes," Thomas said simply, and there was something awful in his honesty. "I chose my children's lives over our friendship. I chose survival over sentiment, and I'll live with that choice because living with guilt is better than watching my family die." Behind Samuel, his cattle had reached the spring and were drinking desperately, their bodies trembling with relief. Thomas's cattle shifted nervously, disturbed by the newcomers, and Samuel could see Thomas calculating how much water was being consumed, how much that consumption would cost him. "Call them back," Thomas said, and now his rifle shifted slightly, not quite aiming at Samuel, but no longer entirely neutral. "Last chance, Sam. Call your cattle back, or I'll drive them off myself." Samuel's hands tightened on his own rifle. Beside him, Jacob made a small sound, fear or protest or both. The ranch hands behind Thomas looked increasingly uncomfortable, men who'd signed on for honest work and were now being asked to choose sides in a conflict that felt less like business and more like fratricide. "I can't do that, Tom," Samuel said quietly. "Those cattle are all that stands between my family and losing everything our fathers built. I won't watch them die when salvation is 50 feet away." "Then we have a problem," Thomas replied, his voice dropping to something harder, colder. The two men stared at each other across 40 feet of moonlit ground, and in that moment Samuel understood with terrible clarity that this was the point where friendship ended and something darker began. No words would bridge this gap. No compromise existed that both men could accept. Someone would win this confrontation, and someone would lose. And the thing they'd both lose regardless of the outcome was the bond their fathers had forged and they'd inherited. "Don't make me do this," Thomas said, and his voice cracked slightly. "Please, Sam, don't make me choose between our friendship and my children's lives." "You already made that choice," Samuel replied. "6 months ago when you refused to share. I'm just making mine now." Time seemed to stretch, the moment extending into something eternal. The cattle drank obliviously, unaware they were the currency in a transaction that would cost far more than water. The moon watched with its ancient, indifferent light, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a lonely sound that perfectly captured the isolation both men felt even standing surrounded by others. Thomas raised his rifle. Samuel raised his. "Pa, don't!" Jacob shouted, his young voice breaking with terror. But it was too late for don'ts, too late for reason, too late for anything except the terrible momentum of desperation meeting desperation. The first shot came from one of Thomas's ranch hands, a young man named Billy Parsons who panicked and fired before anyone else moved. The bullet went wild, striking the ground near Samuel's horse, causing the animal to rear. Samuel fired reflexively, not aiming, just reacting to the threat. His bullet caught Billy in the shoulder, spinning the young man backward into the dirt. Then everyone was shooting. Muzzle flashes lit the night like lightning, thunder rolling across the spring as rifles spoke their ancient language of violence. Samuel's horse went down, a bullet through its chest, and Samuel hit the ground hard, rolling, seeking cover behind the animal's dying body. Jacob was shouting something Samuel couldn't hear over the gunfire, his son's voice lost in chaos. Samuel fired again, saw the second ranch hand drop, clutching his leg. Return fire kicked up dirt inches from his face, stinging his eyes, filling his mouth with grit. The cattle scattered in blind panic, their bodies dark shapes fleeing across moonlit ground. And then, sudden as it started, the shooting stopped. Samuel lay behind his dead horse, breathing hard, his ears ringing, his hands shaking with adrenaline. Across the killing ground, Thomas stood beside the spring, his rifle lowered, his face a mask of horror. "Jacob," Thomas whispered, the word carrying impossible distance. Samuel's heart stopped. He rose, stumbling around his dead horse, and saw his son lying motionless near the spring's edge. Jacob's chest was dark with blood, his eyes open and staring at the stars he'd never see again. His 16 years ended in violence neither his father nor Thomas had wanted, but both had caused. Samuel fell to his knees beside his boy, his hands hovering over the wound, unable to touch it, unable to accept what his eyes were telling him. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." Thomas approached slowly, his rifle forgotten, his face wet with tears that reflected moonlight. "Sam, he started, but Samuel's anguished roar cut him off. "You killed him." Samuel screamed, his hands now gripping Jacob's body, trying to hold on to what was already gone. "You killed my boy." "I didn't fire," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "I swear, Sam, I never pulled my trigger. It was—" He looked around wildly at his ranch hands, both wounded, both watching this tragedy unfold with pale, shocked faces. "I don't even know whose bullet." "It doesn't matter." Samuel was screaming now, grief and rage indistinguishable. "You brought guns. You wouldn't share. This is your fault." Thomas sank to his knees across from Samuel, Jacob's body between them like an accusation. "It's both our faults," he said quietly, each word seeming to cost him something vital. "We let pride and fear turn us into men our fathers wouldn't recognize. We chose cattle over conscience." Samuel looked up, meeting Thomas's eyes across the space where his son's life had ended. In those eyes he saw his own grief reflected, his own guilt magnified, and he understood with crushing certainty that killing Thomas now, and he could, his rifle was within reach, Thomas was unarmed and broken, would solve nothing, wouldn't bring Jacob back, wouldn't restore what had been lost tonight, would only add more death to ground already soaked with it. "Get out," Samuel whispered, his voice raw. "Take your men and get out. I never want to see you again." Thomas nodded, rising slowly, moving like a man 3 times his age. He took 2 steps, then stopped and looked back. "I'm sorry, Sam, for whatever that's worth. I'm so damn sorry." Samuel didn't respond. He just held his dead son and listened to Thomas and his wounded ranch hands stumble away into darkness, leaving him alone with his grief and the sound of cattle drinking from a spring that had cost more than any water was worth. Dawn came gray and cold, leaching color from a world that had already lost its meaning. Samuel sat beside Jacob's body, his hand resting on his son's chest where no heartbeat would ever sound again. The cattle had wandered back in the night, drawn by thirst stronger than fear, and now they drank from Holloway Spring as if nothing had changed, as if a boy's life hadn't been the price of their survival. Martha arrived with Emma just after sunrise, driving their wagon across the dry land with a desperation Samuel could feel even at a distance. She must have known something was wrong when they hadn't returned by dawn, must have felt it in her bones the way mothers do when their children are in danger. The sound she made when she saw Jacob would haunt Samuel for whatever remained of his life. Not a scream, something deeper, more primal, the sound of a soul being torn in half. She fell to her knees beside their son, gathering him into her arms as if she could will warmth back into his cold flesh, as if the sheer force of a mother's love could reverse what bullets and pride had done. Emma stood frozen, her 13-year-old face struggling to process what her eyes were seeing. Her brother, who taught her to ride, who'd protected her from bullies, who'd promised to always be there, lying still and silent in a spreading pool of dark blood that looked black in the morning light. What happened? Martha's voice was barely recognizable, scraped raw by grief. "Samuel, what did you do?" "We needed water," Samuel said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. The cattle were dying. I thought. You thought what? Martha looked up at him, and Samuel saw something break in her eyes, something that would never be whole again. You thought water was worth our son's life. You thought cattle mattered more than Jacob. No. God, no. Martha, don't. She held up one hand, the gesture sharp as a slap. Don't try to explain this. Don't try to make it make sense. Our boy is dead because you and Thomas Holloway couldn't share a spring, because pride mattered more than human life. She stood slowly, still holding Jacob, though his body was too heavy for her to carry. Emma moved to help her mother, and together they lifted him into the wagon with a tenderness that made Samuel's chest ache. Take us home, Martha said, not looking at Samuel. We need to bury our son. They buried Jacob on the hillside overlooking the ranch, in the small plot where Samuel's parents lay. The grave took all day to dig. The ground was hard as iron from 3 years of drought, resisting the shovel as if the earth itself refused to accept this death. The few neighbors who still remained in the territory came to pay respects. They stood in uncomfortable silence, knowing what had happened at Holloway Spring, knowing that 2 families had destroyed themselves over water. No one knew what to say. There were no words adequate for this kind of loss. The preacher from town spoke about God's plan and eternal rest and peace beyond suffering. Samuel heard none of it. He stood beside the grave watching dirt fall on his son's face, each shovelful sealing Jacob away from the world forever. Martha didn't cry. She stood straight and silent, her face carved from stone, her hand gripping Emma's shoulder, so hard her knuckles were white. When the grave was filled and the small wooden cross planted, she finally spoke. "This ranch killed my son," she said, her voice clear and cold. "This drought, this land, this endless struggle for survival. I won't stay here. I can't." Samuel looked at his wife across their son's grave. "Martha, I'm taking Emma to my sister's in California. We leave tomorrow." Her eyes met his, and there was nothing in them but emptiness. "You can come if you want, but if you choose to stay here, choose this ranch and these cattle over what's left of your family, then you choose alone. You can't just leave. This is our home, our life. Our life died last night with our son." Martha turned away from the grave, from Samuel, from everything they'd built together. "Emma, come. We have packing to do." Emma followed her mother, but she looked back once at Samuel. In her young face he saw accusation and betrayal and a grief too large for her small body to contain. Then she was gone, walking down the hill toward the ranch house, leaving Samuel standing alone beside his son's grave. That night, Samuel sat on his porch as he'd done 1,000 times before. But everything was different now. The ranch that had been his pride felt like a prison. The land he'd fought to keep felt like a curse. The cattle drinking from Holloway Spring, water he'd killed his son to access, looked like monuments to his failure. Across the fence line, 200 yards distant, he could see lights burning in Thomas Holloway's ranch house. Samuel wondered if Thomas was sitting on his own porch, carrying his own guilt, drowning in his own grief. Wondered if their old friendship haunted Thomas the way Jacob's last moments haunted Samuel. The drought had taken their cattle, then their friendship, then Samuel's son. But it wasn't finished yet, because Martha was right. The land itself had become toxic, poisoned by what they'd done for it, by what they'd sacrificed to survive it. At dawn, Martha and Emma loaded their belongings into the wagon. Not much: clothes, keepsakes, Jacob's few possessions that Martha couldn't bear to leave behind. Everything else they abandoned. The furniture, tools, the accumulated possessions of 15 years, building a life in this territory. "You could still come," Martha said, but there was no hope in her voice. Just obligation to offer one final chance. Samuel shook his head. "Someone needs to tend Jacob's grave. Make sure he's not forgotten." "He'll never be forgotten." Martha's voice cracked for the first time. "But staying here won't bring him back. It'll just destroy you two." "Maybe I deserve destroying." Martha looked at him for a long moment, and Samuel saw the death of their marriage in her eyes. The final severing of bonds that had held them together through hardship and drought and loss. "Goodbye, Samuel. I pray you find peace. But I can't watch you drown in guilt while pretending it's penance." She climbed into the wagon, Emma beside her. Neither looked back as they drove away, heading west toward California and a future that didn't include him. Samuel watched until they disappeared into the heat shimmer, becoming ghosts swallowed by the horizon. Then he walked to Jacob's grave and sat beside it, his back against the wooden cross, his eyes on the ranch spread below. The cattle grazed peacefully now, healthy and strong from unlimited access to Holloway Spring. They'd survived. The ranch would survive. Everything had survived except the people who'd mattered most. The desert wind blew across the hillside, carrying dust and the scent of sage and the weight of choices that couldn't be unmade. Samuel sat with his dead son and his dying ranch and wondered if there was any difference between survival and damnation, or if, in the end, they were the same thing. 3 weeks passed like a slow death. Samuel lived alone on the ranch, tending cattle that no longer seemed worth the cost of their survival. He visited Jacob's grave every morning and evening, sometimes spending hours sitting beside the wooden cross, talking to his son about nothing and everything. The silence that answered back was its own kind of torture. The drought continued its relentless grip on the territory. More ranchers abandoned their land, loading wagons with whatever they could carry and heading for California or Oregon or anywhere that still had water falling from the sky. The town of Salvation Creek, once a thriving community of 200 souls, dwindled to maybe 50 diehards too stubborn or too broke to leave. Samuel and Thomas hadn't spoken since the night Jacob died. They existed as ghosts to each other, separated by 200 yards and a chasm of guilt neither could cross. Samuel would see Thomas occasionally, moving cattle or repairing fences, and each sighting was a knife twisted in an old wound. Thomas never looked his direction, never acknowledged his presence. They'd become strangers who shared history and bloodshed in equal measure. Then the rain came, not the gentle spring rain that coaxed life from dormant seeds, not the steady summer rain that filled wells and fattened cattle. This was a monster born of atmospheric violence, dark clouds rolling across the sky like cavalry, thunder shaking the ground, lightning turning night into stuttering day. Samuel stood on his porch watching the storm approach, feeling the temperature drop as the wall of water moved toward him. The first drops hit his face like accusations, cold and hard. Then the deluge opened, rain falling so thick he couldn't see 20 feet in any direction. The dry earth, baked hard by 3 years of drought, couldn't absorb water this fast. Within minutes, the ground was running like rivers. Within an hour, the landscape had transformed into a maze of flash floods, water seeking every low point, carving new channels through land that had forgotten what moisture felt like. Samuel saddled his horse and rode through the storm, rain hammering his shoulders, soaking through his clothes in seconds. He needed to check on the cattle, make sure they weren't caught in the flooding. But more than that, he needed to move, needed to do something other than sit in his empty house being slowly buried by guilt. He found half his herd clustered on high ground near the fence line, frightened by the storm but safe. The other half, including his best breeding stock, had wandered toward Holloway Spring and were now trapped on the wrong side of a newly formed stream that was rising fast. Samuel spurred his horse toward them, but the water was already too deep and moving too fast to cross safely. He reined in, cursing, watching his cattle mill in confused panic as the flood rose around their legs. That's when he saw Thomas. His former friend was on the other side of the stream, also on horseback, also trapped by the rising water. But Thomas wasn't watching his own cattle. He was staring at something upstream, his face pale with terror even in the rain-obscured darkness. Samuel followed his gaze and felt his stomach drop. A wall of water was coming down the canyon. Not rain runoff, but a true flash flood. Debris-filled and violent, the kind that could sweep away anything in its path. And directly in its path was Thomas's ranch house, where his wife Catherine and their 3 children were sheltered against the storm. Thomas spurred his horse toward the stream, clearly planning to try to cross despite the obvious danger. The water was chest-deep on his mount and rising fast. Samuel watched as Thomas pushed into the current, watched as the horse lost its footing, watched as both animal and rider were swept downstream, tumbling in the violent water. Samuel didn't think. He rode downstream parallel to the flood, pushing his horse hard, searching for any point where the water might be shallower. He found a spot where the stream widened and the current seemed marginally weaker, though calling it safe would have been generous. He pushed his horse into the water. The current grabbed them immediately, pulling hard, trying to sweep them away. Samuel gripped the saddle horn with one hand and his rope with the other, feeling his horse struggle beneath him, fighting to keep its head above water. They made it halfway across before the horse went down, the current finally winning. Samuel kicked free of the stirrups as they went under, the world becoming a chaos of cold and dark and violent motion. His lungs screamed for air. His limbs flailed for purchase. Then his feet hit bottom, found rock, and he pushed up, breaking the surface, gasping. He grabbed onto a partially submerged tree, hauled himself onto it, searched the torrent for Thomas. There, 20 yards downstream, clinging to a boulder, his face barely above water, clearly injured and fading fast. Samuel worked his way along the tree until he could throw his rope. The first throw fell short. The second missed Thomas's grasping hand by inches. The third time, Thomas caught it, wrapped it around his wrist, and Samuel pulled. It took everything Samuel had. His shoulders screamed. His hands burned from the rope. His feet kept slipping on the wet bark. But inch by inch, he dragged Thomas closer, until finally he could grab his former friend's coat and haul him onto the tree. They lay there gasping, the flood roaring around them, neither able to speak. Thomas was bleeding from a gash on his head, his left arm hanging at an unnatural angle. But he was alive. Your family. Samuel finally managed. The flood. I know. Thomas gasped. I have to get to them. We both do. The water was starting to recede as quickly as it had risen, the main surge passing downstream. Samuel and Thomas struggled to shore, helping each other across ground turned to mud, both men moving like broken things held together by will alone. They found Thomas's horse half a mile downstream, dead, its neck broken. Samuel's mount was nowhere to be seen. So they ran, two men in their 40s with injured bodies and destroyed lungs, racing against a flood that had minutes on them. They reached Thomas's ranch just as the wall of water hit. The house was built on slightly elevated ground, not much, but enough that the main force of the flood split around it rather than through it. But the barn took the full force. Samuel and Thomas watched as it simply disintegrated, planks and timber and everything inside swept away like toys. Thomas's family had made it out and were clustered on the highest ground they could reach, a rocky outcrop maybe 30 feet from the house. Catherine held their youngest daughter Sarah in her arms. Their twin sons, both 10 years old, clung to their mother's skirts. They were wet and terrified but alive. The flood water swirled around the base of the outcrop, rising slowly but steadily. In another few minutes, it would reach them, and there was no higher ground to retreat to. The rope, Thomas gasped, turning to Samuel. You still have your rope. Samuel looked at the coil still attached to his belt, then at the distance to the outcrop, then at Thomas's family, trapped and waiting to die. It's not long enough to reach them and get back to safety, Samuel said. Whoever goes out there is staying out there. Thomas nodded, understanding. Then I go. They're my family. You've got a broken arm and a head wound. You pass out halfway and drown, and they die anyway. Samuel was already tying the rope around his waist. I'll get them. You anchor me here. Sam, your family needs their father. Samuel met Thomas's eyes. Mine is already gone. Jacob's dead. Martha and Emma left. I've got nothing to lose. You'll die. Maybe. Samuel pulled the rope tight. Or maybe I finally do something that matters more than cattle and pride and all the other bullshit we've killed ourselves over. Before Thomas could argue further, Samuel waded into the flood. The water was chest-deep and rising, the current still dangerously strong. Samuel fought for every step, the rope playing out behind him, Thomas holding the other end with his good arm. 20 feet, 25, 30. The water rose to his shoulders, then his chin. Then he was swimming, pulling himself forward with the rope as much as with his strokes. He reached the outcrop, grabbed onto the rock, pulled himself up beside Catherine and the children. Up close, he could see their terror, the way they trembled from cold and fear. "Samuel," Catherine's voice was disbelieving. "What are you?" "No time. The water's still rising. We need to get you across." He looked at the children. Sarah couldn't be more than 5, the twins maybe 10. "Who's the strongest swimmer?" "Daniel," Catherine said, indicating one of the twins. "But Samuel, that current." "I'll tie the rope around him, send him across first. Once he's safe, Thomas can help pull the others." Samuel was already wrapping the rope around Daniel's thin chest. "You can do this, son. Your pa's waiting on the other side." Daniel nodded, trying to be brave, though his lips were blue and his whole body shook. Samuel lowered him into the water, kept one hand on the rope. "Kick hard. Don't fight the current. Angle across it. Understand?" Another nod. Then Samuel let him go. Thomas pulled from the other side, and Daniel swam, his small arms churning, his legs kicking desperately. Twice the current took him under. Twice he surfaced, still fighting. And then Thomas was grabbing him, hauling him onto shore, wrapping him in his good arm. They did the same with the second twin, David, then with little Sarah, who couldn't swim at all, so Samuel had to swim beside her, holding her head above water while Thomas pulled them both. By the time Catherine went across, Samuel was exhausted, his muscles trembling, his lungs burning. He held the rope while Thomas pulled her, watching make sure she made it. Then he looked down at the water, still rising around the outcrop. He looked at the rope, knowing there wasn't enough length left to get him back to shore. He'd known that from the start, had understood the mathematics of this rescue the moment he'd volunteered. From the shore, Thomas realized it too. "Sam!" he shouted over the roar of the water. "Tie it around yourself. We'll pull you in." Samuel shook his head. "Not enough rope, Tom. You know it." "Then there has to be." Thomas was frantically looking around, searching for another rope, another option, anything. "Take care of your family," Samuel called back. "They need you. And Tom," he paused, making sure he had his old friend's attention. "I'm sorry. For everything. For Jacob, for the spring, for letting pride matter more than what we had." "Sam, no. You can't. We'll find a way. Tell Martha and Emma I'm sorry too. Tell them I finally did something Jacob would have been proud of." The water reached Samuel's waist. In another minute, maybe 2, it would take him. He sat down on the rock and waited, watching Thomas hold his family, seeing them all safe and together, seeing what he'd chosen cattle over, what he'd lost everything to protect. The water rose to his chest. Then, in the distance, he heard it. The rain slowing, the thunder moving away. The storm was passing. The flood would recede. Thomas's family would survive. The drought was finally broken. Samuel Crane smiled as the water took him. They found Samuel's body 3 miles downstream, caught in a tangle of cottonwood roots where the flood had deposited him like driftwood. Thomas identified him, then carried him back to the Crane ranch himself, walking the entire distance with Samuel's body over his good shoulder, his broken arm hanging useless, but the weight of his friend somehow bearable. Thomas buried Samuel on the hillside next to Jacob, digging the grave himself despite his injuries, despite Catherine's protests, despite the doctor's orders to rest. He dug until his good hand bled and his back screamed, and the grave was deep enough to be proper. Then he lowered his friend into the ground beside his son and stood there trying to find words that could possibly be adequate. "I don't know if you can hear me, Sam," Thomas said finally, his voice rough. "Don't know if there's anything after this, or if we just stop. But if you're listening, if Jacob's listening, I need you both to know something." He paused, gathering himself. "You were right, Sam, about all of it. The water should have been shared. Our friendship should have mattered more than fear. And my pride, my goddamn stubborn pride, cost you your son, cost you your family, nearly cost me mine." The rain had broken the drought, but it had also broken something in Thomas. The man who'd refused to share because he was afraid of losing everything had nearly lost everything anyway, and had been saved only by the sacrifice of the friend he'd betrayed. "I'm going to make this right," Thomas continued. "Can't bring you back. Can't give Jacob his life. But I can make sure your ranch doesn't die too. Make sure what your father and grandfather built doesn't just wash away." Over the following weeks, Thomas did exactly that. He moved Samuel's surviving cattle to his own land, merged the herds, treated them as if they were his own. He hired men to repair the Crane Ranch buildings, to maintain the property, to keep it from falling to ruin, and he brought water to it, not from Holloway Spring, but from a new well he paid engineers to dig, using his own money to ensure the Crane land would never thirst again. When Martha received word of Samuel's death, she returned from California with Emma. She thought she was coming to sell the ranch, to settle Samuel's affairs, and be done with this place that had taken so much from her. Instead, she found her property maintained, her cattle healthy, and Thomas Holloway waiting on her porch with documents showing everything he'd done. "I can't give you back your husband," Thomas said, holding his hat in his hands like a penitent. "Can't give Emma back her father or her brother, but your ranch is whole. Your cattle are thriving, and there's money from the sales of calves, enough to get you and Emma through the next few years comfortably." Martha looked at this man who'd been her husband's friend, then enemy, then, at the end, his salvation. "Samuel saved your family." "He did, and I'm trying to honor that. But also," Thomas's voice broke, "I need to do this, Martha. For Sam, for Jacob, for what we used to be before fear made us monsters. Please don't take this from me. It's all I have left to give." Martha studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "We'll run the ranches together. Share the water, share the land, share the work, the way our husbands should have done from the beginning." "Yes," Thomas said, "the way they should have." The two ranches merged fully over that summer, not through conquest or acquisition, but through cooperation born of tragedy and watered with blood. The fence line that had separated Crane and Holloway property for 2 generations came down. The two families, what remained of them, became one. Emma and Thomas's daughter Sarah became inseparable. 2 girls bonded by loss and the strange circumstances that had made them sisters in everything but name. Catherine and Martha developed a cautious friendship. 2 women who understood grief and survival in equal measure. The twin boys helped with the cattle, learning the work their father and Samuel had fought over. The land healed slowly. The rain, once it started, continued. Not the deluge of that terrible night, but steady precipitation that turned brown grass green again, that filled the wells and the spring, and made the territory remember what it had been before the drought. Cattle that had been skeletal grew fat. Ranchers who'd fled began returning. Salvation Creek swelled back to its former population. But the 2 graves on the hillside remained, maintained meticulously, visited often. Thomas went up there every Sunday after church, sometimes alone, sometimes with his family. He'd sit between Samuel and Jacob's markers and talk to them about the ranch, about the cattle, about the children growing up in the shadow of their sacrifice. "The water's flowing good this year," he'd say. "Both wells, the spring, even got some new ponds forming in the low areas. More than enough for everyone." He'd pause, looking out over the merged property. "Wish you were here to see it, Sam. Wish your boy could see what his death bought. Not just my family's survival, something bigger, something better." Years passed. The drought became legend, the kind of story old-timers told to illustrate how bad things used to be. A new generation grew up on the combined Crane-Holloway ranch, children who knew the story of the 2 friends who destroyed each other over water, and the sacrifice that had finally broken the cycle. Emma grew into a woman fierce and capable, taking over management of the cattle operation with a skill that would have made Samuel proud. She never married, never left the ranch, but poured her life into the land her father and brother had died for. On the anniversary of Jacob's death each year, she'd ride to the graves and spend the day there, keeping vigil. Thomas grew old watching the ranch prosper, watching the families merge and thrive, watching something good grow from the ashes of the worst thing he'd ever done. His hair went white. his back bent, his broken arm never quite healed right. A permanent reminder of the night the flood came. On his deathbed, surrounded by children and grandchildren, his final words were for his old friend. "I'm coming, Sam," he whispered. "Hope you saved a place. Hope there's forgiveness on the other side, because God knows I've been trying to earn it down here." Catherine held his hand as he passed, and the next day, following his written instructions, they buried Thomas Holloway on the hillside beside Samuel Crane, reuniting the friends who'd been separated by pride and brought back together by sacrifice. 3 graves now stood on that hill overlooking the ranch their fathers had built. 3 markers telling a story of friendship, betrayal, death, and redemption. And below them, the land they fought over flourished, green and vital, fed by water that now flowed freely for all who needed it. 20 years after the drought ended, Emma Crane stood on the hillside beside 3 graves weathered by time and wind. She was 33 years old now, her face carrying the same fierce determination that had defined her father, her eyes holding depths of sorrow that came from losing family too young. Beside her stood Sarah Holloway, now Sarah Chen, having married a railroad engineer who'd helped bring the new spur line through their territory. The 2 women had remained close through all the years, bound by the strange circumstances that had made them family. "They'd be proud of what we've built," Sarah said, looking down at the sprawling ranch complex below. Where once there had been 2 struggling properties, separated by a fence and failing from drought, now there was one of the most prosperous operations in Arizona territory. Emma nodded. The Crane Holloway Ranch. Sounds strange to say it, even after all these years. "Your father saved my family," Sarah said quietly. "Never lets me forget how lucky I am, how close we came to losing everything." "Both our fathers were fools," Emma replied, but there was no anger in her voice anymore, just sadness for the waste of it all. Pride and fear made them enemies. Took my brother's death and your father's near loss and my father's sacrifice to teach them what they should have known all along. A wagon was approaching from the main road, dust rising behind it. Emma shaded her eyes and recognized the occupants, Martha, now 67 and still formidable, and Catherine, white-haired but sharp-eyed. The matriarchs returning from town with supplies and probably gossip about which young ranchers were courting which young women. "Your mother never remarried," Sarah observed. "No," said she'd had one love in her life, and even though it ended badly, it was enough. Emma's voice softened. "She talks to him sometimes, when she thinks no one's listening. Tells him about the ranch, about me, about how the land he died for is thriving." They stood in comfortable silence. 2 women connected by tragedy transformed into legacy. The ranch below employed 40 men, ran 3,000 head of cattle, and had water rights to multiple springs and wells that fed not just their property, but neighboring ranches too. What Samuel and Thomas had hoarded and fought over, their children now shared freely. "The new water cooperative is meeting next week," Emma said. "We need to finalize the agreement about shared access to the northern springs." "My brothers will be there representing our family's interests," Sarah replied. "But you know they'll vote for fair distribution. Father's death taught them that cooperation beats competition." A young man on horseback was riding up the hill toward them. David Holloway, one of the twins, now the ranch foreman. He'd grown into a solid, capable man, though he carried a limp from being thrown by a bronc 3 years back. "Emma, Sarah," he greeted them with a nod. "Just wanted to let you know the new herds settled in the north pasture. And that engineer from Tucson arrived, the one who's going to survey for the irrigation project." "Irrigation," Emma murmured. "Father would never have imagined it. All that water we fought over, and now we're planning to bring even more from the river." "Times change," David said. "We change with them or we die. Your father and mine learned that too late, but they learned it, and they taught us." After David rode back down the hill, Emma knelt beside her father's grave. The wooden marker had been replaced years ago with proper stone, carved with words Martha had chosen. Samuel James Crane, 1841 to 1883. He gave everything so others could live. Beside it, Thomas's marker read, Thomas William Holloway, 1841 to 1901. He lived to honor a friend's sacrifice. And between them, smaller but no less important, Jacob Samuel Crane, 1867 to 1883. Gone too soon, never forgotten. Emma traced her brother's name with her fingers, a ritual she'd performed 1,000 times. "I'm 40 years older than you now, Jake," she whispered. "Lived more than twice as long as you got to. Sometimes I wonder what you'd have become. What kind of man? If you'd have forgiven Pa for getting you killed. If you'd understand why he did what he did at the end." The wind carried her words away across the rangeland, across the green grass and flowing water and thriving cattle that had been bought with blood and paid for in grief. Sarah touched Emma's shoulder. "Come on. Mother and your mother will be wondering where we are. And you know Catherine gets anxious if she can't account for everyone." Emma rose, brushing dust from her dress. Together, the two women walked down the hillside toward the ranch house, where smoke rose from the chimneys and laughter carried on the evening air. A house that held two families merged by tragedy and held together by choice. Behind them, the three graves stood sentinel over the land, markers not just of death, but of the hard lesson written in the dust of Arizona territory, that water hoarded dies in the cup, but water shared creates rivers that nurture everyone. That some prices are too high to pay. That pride and fear make poor foundations for anything meant to last. And that sometimes it takes losing everything to understand what actually matters. The sun set over the Crane Holloway Ranch, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, the same colors that had witnessed gunfights and grief and guilt. But now those colors fell on land at peace, on families at rest, on water flowing free for all who needed it. The drought had ended 20 years ago, but its lessons would last forever. See you around, my friend. I've got another story for you.